Good evening and welcome to tonight's webinar, COVID Vaccine Update for SAGPs. My name's Roberta Morris and I'm the CPD Program Coordinator with the College for SA and NT. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land and sea on which we live and work and pay our respects to elders, past and present, and extend that respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here this evening. Just some housekeeping matters to begin with. For those who aren't too familiar with the Zoom platform, your control panel is located at the bottom of the presentation screen. If you can't see your control panel, hover your cursor over the bottom of the screen and it will appear. We've put everyone on mute to ensure that there is no background noise causing distractions. Please chat to us and send us your questions using the Q&A box. We'll try to answer questions at the end of the presentation. Our presenters this evening are Dr. Emily Kirkpatrick, Deputy Chief Medical Officer and Deputy Chief Public Health Officer, Department of Health and Wellbeing SA Health, Dr. Branka Grubor, Head of Viral Immunology at the University of Adelaide, Dr. Rob Hall, Public Health Physician, SA Health. The two learning outcomes for this activity are to identify the approved vaccines for rollout and identify the role of SAGPs in the vaccine rollout. Please note that 2 CPD points are allocated for this activity and we will upload the points on your behalf. Please do not quick log this activity. I will now hand over to Emily.
Good evening. Welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us for tonight's webinar particularly around the South Australian COVID-19 vaccination program, and really to talk through where we're up to now here with the rollout. Of course, next Monday is the first day for our vaccine to be commencing here in South Australia. So I will just confirm no issues with sound, it sounds like. Perfect, so I'll keep going. So really, I'm going to start going through where we're up to with the program here and talk around the safety. And we have Branka with us tonight, who is fantastic and will help provide some expert immunology advice to me, no doubt. So thank you for joining us tonight, Branka. Unfortunately, Rob Hall was a very last minute apology due to an unwell family member. So it'll just be the two of us here, but we'll cover through the material that Rob was going to talk about this evening. So we'll start off. So what we're trying to do with all of this, I guess, is try and produce a safe and effective vaccine here for South Australia, but also for Australia. And of course, we do have the 2 vaccines now that have been provisionally approved through the TGA. With the Pfizer vaccine, of course, we saw the shipment as it arrived 2 days ago, lots of photo opportunities there. And then with AstraZeneca as well yesterday, receiving provisional approval, which is very exciting indeed. So here in South Australia, we will be having the Pfizer vaccine. It will be our first vaccine that we'll be rolling out, which will commence next Monday. We understand shipping will happen tomorrow, which is very exciting. Will be shipped over the weekend by air to us here in South Australia and then ready for rollout. And I'll talk through around how the Pfizer vaccine is stored, a bit around its composition and where we're up to in terms of how many doses do you actually get out of a vial, which I no doubt will be of interest to people, and where we're up to with our syringe supply here in the country. So we'll move through introduction. I'm not very good at following my slides. I go off track. Yes, and really this is around how we can sort of halt the pandemic and really delay any further spreading out of it as we move forward, as we do really want to get back on top of things very quickly and hopefully not drag this out for several years. So I'm going to move through. So really, I think this slide is to demonstrate where we differentiate between the state and the Commonwealth. And I've had certainly lots of inquiries from GPs around, well, I want to be involved with the vaccine. Can you help me get involved? And I think what's really important to talk about here is there's really 2 very distinct roles and responsibilities between the Commonwealth and the state government. So we'll talk around the Commonwealth government first of all. And so really their responsibility is the vaccine purchasing. We've heard about the millions and millions of vaccines that have been purchased by the government and bringing in, and of course the Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and then moving to the Novavax later in the year, if it's approved by the TGA, that is. The transport and distribution is also a responsibility of the Commonwealth as well. And I think that is really important to talk about, that all of the distribution out, particularly into the aged care sector, is going to be managed by the Commonwealth. There's a national booking system. Unfortunately, the booking system is not yet live and operationalised, but by 1B should be up and running. There's also been a national communications campaign and really around bringing the public confidence on board with our vaccine rollout. And that's been a very heavy, big investment from the Commonwealth. And finally, the actual administration of the vaccine in non-government residential aged care settings and disability care. So we have over 280 aged care facilities here in South Australia, and a small number of those are SA Health run clinics, but the majority are all Commonwealth, all sit within the Commonwealth space in terms of responsibility as part of the vaccine rollout. And that will also be commencing early next week. I understand 4 residential aged care facilities will be included in the rollout next week here in South Australia. However, as with all things, we haven't yet got the vaccine. That is coming tomorrow. So that's the Commonwealth responsibility. Now, in terms of the state government. So what is SA Health doing in this space? Well, we're looking at the qualifications and the training of the workforce, which is very important in terms of scoping and credentialing to be able to undertake vaccination. So some of the key areas to think about with this are enrolled nurses and registered nurses, and where do they fit within the training and then administration. So we know the registered nurses, that fits within scope of practice. We haven't expanded the scope of practice for the actual administration and consenting of the vaccine to enrolled nurses at this stage, but that can be considered later on down as the phases become more larger population groups included in the phases. And also the other thing to consider is SAS and the role of SA Ambulance as well. We know they'll play an important role, particularly in our rural areas and in the APY lands, no doubt. Clinical safety and quality fits within our state government responsibility as well. So it is a requirement to be reported through any adverse outcomes or incidents that occur. So for phase 1A, that's all going to be managed through the state government. So that's the healthcare workers who work on the front line, who are swabbing people for COVID-19, who are working in our emergency departments, who are working in our respiratory clinics. That all fits within the 1A state government responsibility. The next thing is around the vaccination site. So all LHNs, all EDs across the state will be involved in vaccination to some degree. And we have 9 hubs for the Pfizer vaccine, which is spread with 4 in Metro, 5 in regional areas. We also have to real-time report to the Commonwealth, which has been a huge endeavour for us to try and fix up our IT systems so that we can report into the air as part of this as well. We're working on our local comms plans as well, and then rolling out to the South Australian community. So our focus is for 1A in the first week. I think I've got that on my next slide. No, I'll talk about that now then. For the first week is rolling out to our Medi-Hotel workers and the quarantine pathways. So that's about 1,800 people that will be vaccinated within the first week, will just be from that cohort. And then the second group that we'll be vaccinating will be those working in our EDs and ICUs, particularly at the RA and the Women's and Children's are 2 sites for COVID positive patients. And then the third group of that are our swabbing staff, which includes a large number of GPs as well who work within the respiratory clinics, are included in phase 1A. And all the data has been submitted to SA Health from all the different organisations to make sure we're capturing everyone in that space. Then on top of that, we'll also be vaccinating within our EDs and ICUs across the state as well. It's part of our second part of phase 1A. And also in phase 1A is our residential aged care facilities. And I mentioned the Commonwealth is responsible for that rollout and administration, which will be performed through Aspen Medical, I believe, the contracted provider. But certainly we'll have an important role with GPs, given that a large number of GPs obviously work in aged care facilities and look after so many patients in aged care space. So it is, I think, an area that probably needs a little bit more clarity provided, and we'll no doubt have that clarity over the coming weeks. As we know, it's so important to vaccinate those who are most vulnerable to COVID, which is our elderly population. So I'm now going to go through the types of vaccines, so into what are the vaccines and where are we at. So we know there's 3 vaccines, as I mentioned. We've got the Pfizer vaccine, the AstraZeneca and the Novavax, and all of these will require 2 doses of the vaccine. Now, I will ask you as well, Branka, in this as well. Obviously, the AstraZeneca was approved yesterday with provisional approval. And I noted as well, there were comments around the age group as well with over 65, that it was on a case-by-case basis in terms of whether the vaccine is suitable. So I was hoping you might be able to make a comment on that as well, if you're happy to.
Yeah, of course. I think that's mainly come from the data that emerged from South Africa. Primarily, the most recent reports about vaccine not being particularly efficacious in that group against the South African variant. So the data that's also coming from United Kingdom at the moment is the preference is given to the Pfizer vaccine and the US Moderna vaccine, simply because they are just more potent and more immunogenic and eliciting high titers of neutralizing antibodies in this aging population. But I think the big question is going to come from new data is set to emerge about AstraZeneca from United States. There's a big trial that's underway now, so that should clear a lot of things up.
Thanks, Branka. And also in terms of AstraZeneca, a lot of discussion, which I'm going to get to, around the dosing interval as well, around pushing out the dosing interval up to 12 weeks, and what your thoughts are on that and whether that does increase the efficacy of the vaccine.
From my understanding is that pushing the dose to 12 weeks is mainly in United Kingdom due to limited supply. So in an attempt to vaccinate as many individuals as possible in a very short time frame to reduce the transmission and prevent new variants from emerging. So I think that's come from United Kingdom. A lot of immunologists and scientists are opposed to the idea because it's not proven or shown to be more immunogenic or efficacious if the dose is stretched out to 12 weeks. So the preference is to keep it at 3 weeks between the two shots.
That's excellent. Thank you.
Okay.
All right, so we'll keep going through the slides and where we're up to. So we know there's the way we've set it up is with the Pfizer vaccine being 3 weeks apart, and the AstraZeneca, really we're looking at whether it will be up to being 12 weeks apart, depending on how we go, probably with our vaccine supply as well, will be a factor in how we roll that out here in Australia. Whether we do run that at 4 weeks or move to 12 weeks will be very interesting. So with the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca, both are given through intramuscular injection. And then, of course, the biggest issue has been the storage of this vaccine and how do we distribute this across the whole country into our regional rural areas, particularly the Pfizer vaccine being stored at -70. But the really good news with the -70, there's more and more information emerges around this. It seems very straightforward and for the pharmacy group at the RA, I've been told, to defrost the vaccine overnight so that it can go straight into the fridge and then be kept for 5 days. And in fact, under the Pfizer protocols that I was looking at today, it can be kept for up to 30 days with dry ice, which is interesting with regular re-applications or I'm not sure what you call it, putting a new supply of dry ice every 5 days, in fact, allows you to store it for up to 30 days, which is really quite interesting. So not defrosted, maintaining it at a frozen state. They've come up with all these ingenious ways of how they store the vaccine, how they transport it. Fascinating. Had no idea about freezers like I do now. So very interesting. At this stage, we have 2 freezers here in South Australia, one at the Royal Adelaide and one at Flinders Medical Centre, which were both delivered today. We've also got a couple of freezers as well through DHL, which are the provider that's being used to distribute the vaccine across the country. And also a couple of freezers as well at Pfizer site here in South Australia. So lots of options for our freezers, and we can also order more freezers, quite straightforward when we do have more vaccine supply. So we'll be moving those freezers out to our hub sites, particularly in the regional areas. The AstraZeneca is stored at normal refrigeration temperature, which is very helpful, especially for general practice. In terms of the age advice, 85 plus on a case-by-case basis and discussion in terms of the COVID vaccine, and certainly where we're advocating for that in our residential aged care facilities. We know that if someone does contract COVID over the age of 90, their mortality rate does significantly increase. So therefore, we really would be advocating for individuals who were at risk or potentially in that environment where they could be exposed to be vaccinated. But then that needs to be weighed up with the risk of community transmission. And then AstraZeneca 65 on a case-by-case basis, which we just spoke about previously. I keep moving my slides around by accident. Sorry, apologies. In terms of pregnancy advice, so there has been new advice that's come out through the TG, through ATAGI, it was yesterday, around pregnancy advice, which did confirm that it could be used, the Pfizer, in pregnancy on a case-by-case basis, discussing with GP obstetrician around what your preference would be based on your risk profile. And of course, the reason for that being was that pregnant women who were pregnant were generally not included in the trials overseas, so it's very difficult to assess. Is that right, Branko? I've got that correct?
Yes, they weren't included, but in the Pfizer trial, there were 23 people, I think, that became pregnant, and there was one miscarriage in a non-vaccinated group. So there have been women that have subsequently fallen pregnant in the trial with no adverse events, and there is great follow-ups now. I think in the AstraZeneca, 21 people became pregnant, no difference between vaccinated, non-vaccinated group. And there is a big push in the United Kingdom for healthcare workers at greater risk of contracting COVID to actually do take on the COVID vaccine, even though they're pregnant. So, but which is a bit different. Their situation is different to what we're experiencing here.
Yep, that's very helpful. So hopefully more data will emerge over the coming months around pregnancy safety. Very safe in breastfeeding as well, and no impact or issues with fertility. That seems to be a common question we keep getting asked here at SA Health, is around fertility. Does it impact fertility? But no evidence that we've uncovered. Branko, are you aware of any issues at all with fertility?
No, the only data to date has been from preclinical studies, extensive preclinical studies that were done so far with no adverse events in pregnancy or affecting fertility. So,
thank you. All right, so hopefully that starts to put your mind at ease when you advise your patients around the vaccine. Now, vaccine rollout, let's talk through around the ATAGI priority groups. I have mentioned this already a little bit in terms of where we're up to with the priority cohorts, but I'll go through a slide that talks through around the priority population groups. And we've got a number of subgroups within those groups, as I mentioned before. So this has come straight from the Commonwealth Department around the health population priority group. So it's been set by the Commonwealth, and then we've sort of had to enact it and work out our individual priorities within each group. So we talks around the aged care, disability care, residents. I noticed there was a question that's come through already in the chat box around the disability. Where will patients in disability housing fit in the rollout? And so they will be included, we know, with the disability sector with DHS in 1A actually. So really targeting the most vulnerable people in our community as part of the phase 1A, and DHS are working collaboratively with SA Health to make sure that we can get people vaccinated and that they can help lead that vaccination program as well. It's important for those who are caring or providing support to also receive vaccination. Now, I've had questions as well come through around GPs who provide services in aged care. Are they then eligible for 1A with the aged care vaccine rollout? And they are. So no doubt there'll be a large number of GPs who'll be eligible in phase 1A as well from working in residential aged care or in the disability sector. All right, I'll move through the slides. So we can see large numbers of doses where we anticipate that will end up, and certainly the quarantine border workers being our first priority to quickly get them vaccinated, noting our biggest risk is from overseas, and then moving through the doses into catch up. Now, this is our South Australian rollout timeline, which I think is good to see in terms of where we're hoping to be from a timeline perspective, because I know it gets a little bit confusing thinking, how are we going to vaccinate everyone? So our initial goal has been to vaccinate 80% of the population by October 31st. So we'll see how we go getting through all those numbers. We're hopeful that we'll be able to get most people then vaccinated in September, October from the remaining general population groups, but noting, of course, children at this stage are not included in our vaccine rollout for 16 years and under. But I understand, Branko, there's some studies happening at the moment around children. Is that correct?
Yes, they have initiated new studies in United Kingdom with AstraZeneca, Pfizer, as well as Moderna, which is of no concern to us, but it's similar technology to Pfizer's vaccine in children younger than 12 and over 12 to 16 years old. So that's something that's going to be coming out, I think, in the third quarter of this year. That data is expected.
Yeah, so that might then influence how our vaccine rollout occurs, in whether that becomes part of the childhood immunisation program or school-aged. It's for school-aged children. So just in terms of, I think that hopefully that timeline sort of explains where we're heading with our phase 1A, 1B, 2A, 2B. It sort of, you think, gets a bit confusing, but really it's around moving forward with all of these groups, and then of course 2 vaccines required. And of course the Novavax will be subject to TGA approval as well. All right, so we know phase 1A is the Pfizer vaccine that we're using from late February. So Monday, the 22nd of February, we'll be commencing vaccination, which is very exciting. Then in 1B, so pretty soon afterwards, and in fact, we'll still be vaccinating a lot of 1A, we feel, when we've moved to 1B, which will be our residential aged care facilities. There's no way residential aged care facilities can be vaccinated in 4 weeks across the country. So no doubt that will go on for a number of months to get all the aged care facilities vaccinated. Phase 1B then introduces our AstraZeneca vaccine. And I think this is the phase I'm most excited about, because this is the phase that includes general practice. And this is going to be absolutely critical for us being able to vaccinate the entire state, is having GPs really involved in this process. Understand there are more than 230 GP clinics that put in an EOI here in South Australia to be part of the vaccine rollout. And those the Commonwealth's working through those applications with the PHN to work out what the priority order will be in terms of when people start commencing vaccination in general practice. So very, very exciting. So 1B, we're still moving in those most at risk groups, so older people aged over 70 years of age. Certainly the biggest area for us at SA Health will be all our healthcare workers. So there's about 40,000 people who work for SA Health that will fit into that group. And then of course, general practice as well will be part of that, and GP clinics. Unless you're a respiratory clinic and you're 1A, being more at risk as swabbing staff. The other aspect to mention here is Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people as well. So that will be really important to make sure that we are vaccinating out of the APY lands. Now, there was a question that came through, I just saw pop up around Aboriginal healthcare practitioners and what the scope is. So under the SA standing order for who can vaccinate, Aboriginal healthcare providers can vaccinate under the standing order. And that's similar to paramedics as well. It fits under the same category. So that will be a really important aspect as part of our rollout, will be Aboriginal healthcare workers being able to assist in that rollout. All right, then phase 2A, moving into May 2021, this is really going into the general population groups, but targeting more the age groups in this sector as well. And then 2B in July 2021. And then September 2021 is where we anticipate we'll have the Novavax involved in this space as well, and really thinking about school-based programs, which is where we're hoping to get to with the end of October vaccine rollout for 80% of the population. So as mentioned, there's a number of vaccine clinic locations. We've got 9 sites where we'll be putting the Pfizer hubs, and 7 of those sites still remain to be open, which are at the Lyell McEwin Women's and Children's, and then in our regional areas in Berry, Mount Gambier, Whyalla, Port Pirie and Port Augusta. Now, so people say, well, how do I get my vaccine? I don't live anywhere near those locations. What's going to be really important for us is being able to move out to different areas and to move the vaccine to individuals and to different clinics throughout the state. So we're really interested to see where the GP clinics end up being. We don't yet have that mapped out. And once we do have that knowledge, it will then help to inform us at SA Health where we end up needing additional clinics or larger clinics to support existing infrastructure. We know that pharmacies will also be involved in the phase 2 rollout. However, the details for that are still being worked through. So hopefully we'll know more information. And of course, the public hospitals will be vaccinating throughout, particularly the healthcare workers will take a considerable period of time to get through all the healthcare workers here in the state. Now, Branka, did you want to make any comments at all on our vaccine clinics, locations, anything I've missed?
No, nothing really. It's more, I'm more scrolling through the Q&A and trying to see the questions from everybody, and try and give as much possible information as there is, but yeah, no.
Thank you. Yes, we haven't got to the details of what's actually in the vaccine, which I know people always like to know. How does it work? How does the messenger RNA work? We haven't got to that yet, so we'll come to that soon if that's okay. I'll now talk about delivery to aged care disability. So as I mentioned, the Commonwealth are responsible for all the non-government aged care facilities and sites, but SA Health will be vaccinating the 600 or so beds that we have in our state-based aged care facilities. And we'll be moving through that. And so hopefully we'll be able to vaccinate people within a couple of months in the aged care sector. We know that most at risk, and we really want to make sure people can be vaccinated. So what have we, oh gosh, I'm still skipping over my slides. So 1A, what is there that we need to do to help people know what to do in this space? So essentially what we've been doing is emailing, advising eligibility. So this has been relevant for, will be relevant for staff who are working in respiratory clinics. We've been talking through around the fact that you are at greater risk, but thank you for all the great work you do. So there's screening questionnaire, consent form. We've also worked on a frequently asked questions and also the detail of where the appointment will be. So at the beginning of the Royal Adelaide will be the main site for our phase 1A, but also Flinders Medical Centre will begin staff vaccinations next week as well. So we'll be able to work with both those sites to make sure people can get vaccinated. So what have we done to sort of enable this program to work? Well, we're working with the Commonwealth around their national campaign. There's a lot of state Commonwealth interactions occurring in this space. And then we're also looking at developing our own state-based comms plan that will come out very soon in terms of how do we engage the public. We know from survey data that looked across all the states. In fact, SA had one of the lowest rates out of all the states for vaccine, for planned vaccine uptake, which was a little bit disappointing really, that we were sitting at around 65%. Was the number that we were playing on uptake of the vaccine. I don't know whether that's because we've done so well here in SA with our COVID response, people think that we don't need it, but it means we have to work really hard to be able to talk the community through why we need to be vaccinated and why we need a large percentage of the population to be vaccinated, even though we know herd immunity is not really going to play a big role at the moment. Based on the vaccines that we have, we don't quite understand the ability to transmit the virus and whether you can transmit the virus still with the vaccine. It's so important for us to be able to lift more restrictions and be able to have free movement that we do have large vaccine uptake. I don't know, Branka, if you want to make a comment at all around the transmissibility potential with the vaccine at all.
It's very hard to comment on that because not many phase 3 clinical trials actually looked at it. There is some data that's come out about Pfizer vaccine showing that there is reduced transmissibility with the vaccine, and it's definitely something that's been looked at for AstraZeneca. But initially in the original phase 3 clinical trials that were done, it wasn't something that was examined. But more data is coming, and I think by mid-year there will be a lot more that we can say with certainty, yes, it is reducing. We definitely are seeing a lot more asymptomatic cases with vaccination, which should correlate with lower viral loads in the nose and the throat. So, and we are seeing the success in Israel, where that's all been reduced by 94% now, I think, their hospitalizations. So.
Yes, fascinating about Israel, isn't it? It's really the country everyone's watching to see what happens. Given, I think they're how much I think over 70% of their population has been vaccinated now. Is that
yes,
right?
It has, and even very early on, with they started to see effects in reduction in hospitalization and death. So they're very good. They invest per capita. I think they're one of the biggest investors in medical research in the world. So they do their stuff well.
Oh, that's really good to know. So we'll be watching to see what happens there. In terms of where can people find information, we've been directing people to the SA Health website. There's also the Commonwealth Department of Health website, but we're mirroring a lot of the information across both platforms. The other thing that people wonder about is what's happening with the digital solution side of things. How are we getting information up from your practice software then into the Commonwealth system? So we've got 2 IT solutions that we've currently got. So the first is we're in the process of still building our IT solution for SA Health, which will link into the Commonwealth National Booking System. It then also tracks the distribution of the vaccine in terms of where is it going, and then also reports through adverse events as well. The Commonwealth has also developed a national booking system, as mentioned, but they're also having a reporting dashboard where information will go directly into the air, needs to be uploaded within 48 hours to the air, and therefore will then produce a report as to who's been vaccinated, and then will form part of someone's My Health record or as part of their information from their Medicare data that they can have on their phone and things like that as vaccine record. So there's still work to be done. Unfortunately, both the state and the Commonwealth solutions are not ready to roll out, but hopefully within the next couple of weeks, both will be up and ready to go. So really a lot of paper-based consent forms, paper-based booking systems for the first few weeks, which isn't that surprising as we try to get things all right in the system. Those are the main things I want to talk about in terms of digital solutions. What I was thinking, Branka, is if you're happy to go through a little bit around what's actually within the vaccine. I had a couple of questions today from our live Facebook Q&A around vaccines. One was around egg allergies and is egg an issue? And my answer was no, that there's no risk with having an egg allergy, and there's no animal products at all within the vaccine is another question that gets asked. I then had another one around anaphylaxis as well. What's the risk of anaphylaxis with the vaccine? 1 in 300,000 was the figure we were quoted for Pfizer vaccine, which is what we've then quoted out to public. So very, very rare, but of course need to be performed in a healthcare facility. I don't know if you want to comment at all on that, Branka, around adverse.
The data that's coming out is actually showing that adverse events with the Pfizer vaccine are quite rare. And they do tend to happen very soon, immediately after administration of the vaccine. They are in individuals more prone to allergies and anaphylaxis. So it is something that needs to be monitored. In regards to the egg allergy, the current advice is no, but then again, they do fall into the category of people that have a general history of allergy, and so maybe more prone and therefore would need to be monitored. As to what's in the vaccines, so the Pfizer vaccine is entirely synthetic. It's what we like to call in vitro transcribed RNA. So I see that there was a question in the Q&A whether the carrier part of the RNA vaccines will actually affect our genetic structure. No, it won't, because RNA can't go backwards. Everything is in living cells is DNA, RNA, protein. There was a question continued on to say, how do we know they're not going to become a health problem like HIV virus, which is a type of RNA? Yes, and so is coronavirus as well. But don't forget, they also have the genetic machinery that helps them revert back and actually make the proteins that they need to make. So in the case of synthetic RNA vaccines, it's a synthetic piece of RNA, usually encapsulated in the lipids, like a liposome, which is what gives it stability and is one of the differences why, for example, it can be thawed and capped for about 5 days at 2 to 8 degrees. But RNA is highly thermo unstable, labile, I should say. The other vaccine, the AstraZeneca that we have here, that is a modified chimpanzee adenovirus that cannot replicate. So it's not replicating. It can infect us, but it can't multiply and it can't make us sick. And the third vaccine that we have is more of a standard one that we're used to receiving, which is a protein-based adjuvanted vaccine, which is from Novavax. They all are targeting the spike of the coronavirus. And by targeting the spike, our body generates antibodies with predominantly neutralizing antibodies, so that ultimately we would like to achieve sterile immunity, which means that nobody gets infected or sick. But to date, more data, like I mentioned before, has been on the efficacy in terms of symptoms, hospitalization, and death, and actually testing positive, having viral loads. So they're all quite different. They all target the same thing, and they're all good.
Thanks, Branka. There's quite a few questions in the chat box, I think, of relevant things, and I know you've been looking through and going through some of these questions. So what we might do is sort of start at the beginning and sort of work our way through the questions and have a bit of back and forth conversation around this. The other thing we haven't talked about is the flu vaccine, and having the flu vaccine, and what is the spacing that you need between the flu vaccine and the COVID vaccine. We've been advised 14 days as a period of time that you need between the two vaccines. Of course, logistically, that's not going to work very well for the Pfizer vaccine spacing intervals being 3 weeks, but we would need to give some consideration around that, particularly in the aged care sector. I don't know if you had any comments at all around concurrent vaccines and the COVID vaccine and what the issues may be there.
No, not really. The focus has actually been in the scientific field has been on vaccinating COVID convalescents, rather than looking at because you have to it all comes from a point of view that we've got it pretty good here in Australia, and the rest of the world is just simply focused as much as they can on curbing transmission. So there's been a lot of data on vaccinating convalescent patients with a single dose of RNA vaccine because they work beautifully just after a single dose, and trying to reduce that dosage so they can have more doses available for naive population, but not really much in regards of influenza, which with social distancing and public health measures has been flattened as well in a lot of parts of the world.
Yeah, it's been great to see such low numbers of the flu in the last 12 months. And yes, that's a really good point. We haven't really talked around that at all in terms of, you know, previous COVID infection and what that means for vaccine and whether people should have a vaccine if they've had a COVID infection prior. So you mentioned there about one dose. Are you able to expand on that a little bit as well?
So the data that's coming out to date, and this is all quite early data. So the recommendation by the FDA is if you've had COVID, to wait 90 days before you get immunized. They still want everybody to get immunized, but their standard protocol in the United States that's accepted at the moment is, you know, with Moderna and Pfizer 3 weeks apart. What they're trying to show with the data that's coming out of research labs is that convalescent patients develop phenomenal immune responses after the first dose, and to preserve the vaccines for the rest of the population, there's a big push to actually change this. So yeah, it's all evolving. It's evolving overnight with stuff that's coming out.
Thank you. I'm going to share the screen back to you as well, Elaine, if that's okay. I don't think I need my slide set anymore, so I'm going to stop share just so you've got that there. All right, perfect. So we'll start going through the questions. Now we're up to the Q&A aspect for the last part of the webinar. So we'll start with the first question that came through. Lots of questions and panic from residents and families of Southern Cross Care today about COVID consent having to be returned in 24 hours for administration on Monday, no contact to primary providers. That is concerning, isn't it, when you have that sort of thrown on last minute on your patients? Unfortunately, I'm aware that it is a very quick, fast-paced moving area in terms of vaccinating people next week, but hopefully there's been an opportunity for time to be given, as well as time for consent and lots of time allocated for consent as well. And no doubt some guardianship issues will arise with the aged care space and consent ability. So thank you for raising that question. Hopefully it will be a much smoother process moving forward with the Commonwealth involved in this space. Next question was around, I've heard suggestions there should be a 12-week gap between doses to enable everyone to get one dose quickly and then round two. Is that so? So we talked a little bit about that already, Branka, haven't we, around that 12-week gap in terms of what does that mean?
And there's been some recent data that's come out with the AstraZeneca vaccine that showed better antibody responses in people that have waited 6 weeks, but the number of people enrolled in each one of those studies at different locations was just too low to say that with confidence. So I think there is a big AstraZeneca study pending from United States. So there's a lot of data that's come out that where some participants were given a lower dose by accident in their first shot, followed by a higher dose, and they've had much better antibody responses and efficacy than when they were given equal doses. So now there is a much bigger study underway that should clarify that, and I think everyone's waiting to see what the US data will show.
Yes, and certainly at this stage we're still planning for a 4-week gap between the two vaccines, and not yet landed a national position on whether we will separate it further, but we might if it means that we'll be able to vaccinate more people as we bring on more suppliers. AstraZeneca, thankfully, will hopefully be produced here in Australia through CSL mid-March. So fingers crossed, which I understand they can produce up to 1 million doses a week.
Yeah.
Yeah, so fingers crossed that does happen and they're able to produce the vaccine. I understand that's still a work in progress. Next question was around, now this is definitely a question for you, Branka, not for me. Are the carrier part of the vaccines, the RNA, would they affect our genetic structure? How will we know how long the pieces of RNA in our cells are not going to become a problem in itself, like HIV, which you mentioned before, but just to clarify that.
RNA cannot integrate into a human genome, so they will not become a problem. We also what I would like to reiterate is that although all of these vaccines technologies may seem as a new thing that's occurred in the last 12 months, these are all technologies. Some of them are 10 years old. So they have been taken to extensive preclinical trials and phase 1 clinical trials for other infectious diseases. So AstraZeneca vaccine is one of those technologies that's been worked on for quite some time. It's gone through phase 1 and phase 2 studies for hepatitis C vaccine, for example, as well as for MERS and SARS, which are close cousins to the current coronavirus, as well as Zika virus. RNA vaccines as well have been taken to phase 1 clinical trials. It's just that there's never actually been a public health emergency of this scale to do everything in parallel and throw a lot of money at vaccine development to do it so rapidly.
That's fantastic, isn't it? Really, I think it's wonderful. We may have so many advances so quickly.
Yeah.
And now, next one was around Aboriginal healthcare practitioners. I think we've answered that there is scope certainly to undertake administration under the vaccine code. Will GPs need to be vaccinated to enter aged care facilities? No. So there's going to be no requirement for aged care to be fully COVID vaccinated like there is for the flu vaccine. It won't be part of a direction. And in fact, it won't be mandatory anywhere for the COVID vaccine at this point in time from a state perspective, Commonwealth perspective enforcement. However, it may be a policy position in different areas that there is a requirement for COVID vaccine, and if you choose not to have the vaccine, or it doesn't, there's a particular reason why you're not going to have it. For instance, maybe you're pregnant and don't want to be in that exposure area. Then it is the responsibility to have a discussion with your employer around risk assessing and seeing whether there is alternative work duties for you. But I mean, it is something to consider, but it's certainly not going to be mandatory, which is good. But you never know down the track. Certainly at the moment, that's the position. Case by case. What does case by case mean? So I think that's important to talk through. And we mentioned that around the 65 years and over, 85 years and over. My understanding of this is it really is around the approval process and looking at the study data around where these age cutoffs have come from. Is that right, Branka?
Yes. And looking at the immunogenicity of vaccines in different age groups.
Yes, and we know particularly as you get older, the immunogenicity goes down, doesn't it?
Yes.
So in terms of, if you have someone in a residential aged care facility provide care to, they're sitting in their mid-90s, you're discussing with them around the consent process, should you get vaccinated, should you not? What sort of things might you think of, Branka, in that space in terms of the immunogenicity of that, or whether that is something that they should be concerned about? Because certainly the advice we've been giving out to people has been, look, really, we do encourage you to take up the vaccine, even though it says on a case-by-case basis, this is part of the provisional approval process through the TGA.
I absolutely agree. I mean, that is I think the other comorbidities need to be taken into the account, and that's something that a lot of attention was drawn through with the data emerging from, I think it was Norway a few weeks ago. In my personal opinion, I do think that the Pfizer vaccine should be given to the most at-risk group and much older, simply because it's a lot more immunogenic and it will allow these people to reach that threshold of antibodies that they need for protection.
Yeah, and we've been talking around that as well in terms of, well, what will we do for our regional, rural areas? Because a lot of discussion had been, well, if you're in a regional, rural area, really we want to vaccinate with the AstraZeneca. It's so much easier to transport that out to these areas. But in fact, we will be as much as possible using the Pfizer vaccine, and certainly the Commonwealth will be using the Pfizer vaccine in the residential aged care facilities, which is really, really good news.
I think the addition of extra doses in the last couple of weeks has really helped the federal effort. So there will be, we can vaccinate 10 million people, am I correct, with the supplies we currently have. So I think, yeah, it's good.
It is good. All right, next question was around the logistical decision in the UK to separate by 12 weeks. I think we have talked around this a bit. This is a great question, Mark, that you posted around the gap between the two doses. It was only 55% the efficacy if it was less than 6 weeks, but it was 81% and the gap was 12 weeks or more. This is really an area for exploration further. Branka, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I can actually mention that, like I said before, the biggest problem was that the trials did include different spacing, but the participant numbers were small. So in the UK study, I think 59% of the participants, so that's about 1,400 people, had 2 standard doses, received the second dose between 9 and 12 weeks after the first. And then the other set of data that was published in Lancet comes from a Brazil study, but that was only 18% of people, so about 300. So these are the the conclusions are drawn from combination trial results. So we still really need to wait for the data to come out. And I think, again, in the UK, it's just a push to vaccinate as many people as possible. So we just have to wait and see. The data, the numbers of people that have been vaccinated with this different spacing is still too low to draw certain conclusions and change national immunization plan schedule.
Thank you. Now, next question's around pregnancy here. If the vaccines are not routinely recommended in pregnancy, what would expectations be? If a pregnant woman is heading to the UK or USA or other high prevalence areas, should they have it before they travel? And if a woman of reproductive age is contemplating a pregnancy, should she delay pregnancy plans post-vaccine? So as mentioned, this case by case, gosh, I'm really confusing, aren't I, saying case by case time, given that's what's come out in the advice. But however, there is some very reliable information. The Royal Australian College of in New Zealand, College of Obstetric, gosh, I'm not doing a very good job of this, RANZCOG, have put out advice in this space as well, which has emphasised the need to have that discussion around risk. So if someone was going to an area where they're potentially going to be at risk of being exposed, and we know there have been a number of adverse outcomes from COVID in pregnancy. We know preterm labour has been an issue, particularly for COVID in pregnancy. So it is important that you do have that discussion, or that whoever is involved predominantly in someone's care has that discussion around whether they would benefit from the vaccine. I don't know, Bunker, if you want to add anything further to that.
I think we've covered that as well earlier when talking about in the UK. So again, completely different situation than the one we find ourselves in, but there is now a recommendation for high risk individuals to actually get vaccinated in pregnancy. But the AstraZeneca has been particularly safe. So wait and see.
Yes. Next question. Can you explain the difference between the Pfizer and the AstraZeneca vaccines in terms of how they work? I know you've talked a little bit about this already, Bronco.
They're both they're both against the spike. So that is to elicit antibodies, predominantly neutralizing antibodies, which will prevent the binding of coronavirus to the receptors on our cells and stop it from entering. The main difference between the two vaccines is the RNA vaccine is a little bit better at eliciting good T cell responses. That is because the RNA is delivered directly into the cytoplasm of the cell, where it undergoes MHC class 1 processing and presentation and leads to better T cell responses. AstraZeneca vaccine works a little bit differently. It still elicits antibodies, very high levels of antibodies. So they're very similar with just a little bit of subtle differences between them.
Thank you. Next one was, does case by case, oh gosh, I should have stopped saying case by case, mean that patients who are over 65 years and prefer the Pfizer vaccine, could they wait and have it when it becomes more readily available? Unfortunately, there's going to be little ability to be able to choose which vaccine, unfortunately, that you're given. But look, I mean, it is one of those things where we know that the AstraZeneca is a very safe vaccine to have. And no doubt when we look further down the months, we'll be looking at whether we have booster vaccines or other vaccines that are given then to supplement in this space. So certainly we would be advising that individuals are vaccinated, and even if that means it is with the AstraZeneca vaccine. So I think that's important to take note there, but we'll get more information around AstraZeneca over the next few weeks as well, coming out from the Commonwealth. Regarding the Pfizer study, conflicting information between whether it was blinded, double-blinded, single-blinded, and the online article stating observer blinded only. Do we know what happened with the blinding? I don't have that information. So Branka, do you know about that?
From what I know, they were properly conducted, randomized, double-blinded studies. I haven't heard that, so yeah.
Yep, that fits with what we understand as well, and particularly with TGA approvals as well.
Yeah.
All right, what counts as a medical exemption for vaccination? So this is a good one around this. So we've actually just looked at our healthcare worker policy at SA Health today around how this fits in terms of medical exemption and what classifies an exemption. Look, there's not really an exemption category, unfortunately, for medical exemption. for this case. I mean, you can have an exemption in your workplace if it's something you don't want to have because you're concerned about, moving forward around risks or unknown factors that you're worried or anxious about. But there's not really a medical exemption category for the vaccine. It would be really on a case-by-case basis discussing it because we haven't made it mandatory, the vaccine in this space. So I hope that answers your question. There's not really a space yet for medical exemptions for the vaccine. All right, next question was around the disability independent housing. Yes, so I have talked a little bit about that. That's being rolled out through DHS and making sure that we do vaccinate most vulnerable in groups 1A. Next question, are regular GPs, i.e. not those in aged care or disability or in respiratory clinics in 1B likely to get the Pfizer vaccine or AstraZeneca vaccine? That's an excellent question, Bronwyn, that you posted. Look, at this stage, we are anticipating that majority of the GP clinics that are vaccinating will be the AstraZeneca vaccine, based on the fact of the issues with the ability to store the Pfizer vaccine and those cold chain requirements with the freezer storage at -70. But then when we move into the Novavax, if that's approved, then we may see that more in that space as well, given that's a refrigerator, not freezer based vaccine. So that will be interesting to see, but generally we're expecting it'll be the AstraZeneca vaccine to be in that area, particularly as it's going to be hopefully locally manufactured, being the main source of supply. Immunocompromised criteria was the next question. So the advice being giving is that in terms of being immunocompromised, in fact, you should have the vaccine because you are at greater risk if you do contract COVID-19. I don't know if you want to make a comment on that, Branka.
Yes, that's definitely been the recommendation, that immunocompromised individuals obviously do not mount adequate immune responses or lag in their responses to coronavirus, which then end up resulting in more severe disease. So that's definitely, what I've also read.
Yep. Yeah, thank you. So I think a couple of repeat questions. Let's go over here. Medically at-risk group in 1B. Yes, there's criteria on the Commonwealth website. It was set by ATAGI, the medically at-risk group, who fits into the categories with the examples there. Next one was around who chooses which people get the Pfizer, AstraZeneca. The Commonwealth chooses who gets what. And it really is in that space. We're not pointing fingers, and it will be around in terms of distribution of the vaccine and the cold chain storage. Now, we both mentioned vaccines in 1B category, which will include all GPs. Which one will they get? As mentioned, likely AstraZeneca in general practice setting. Now, we know we are trying to target those who are over the age of 70 more with the Pfizer vaccine. There's a lot of evidence to support that, and we'll be looking at that further in terms of whether those individuals get vaccinated within an LHN SA health facility where the Pfizer vaccine is. And do we have info on the FluVax timeline this year? Yes, thank you. So we are anticipating that we'll still be rolling out the FluVax next month. So we'll see how that goes in terms of our COVID vaccine rollout. It will still be a requirement in the aged care direction that you do need a flu vaccine to enter an aged care facility, but likely that timeline will be pushed out to the 30th of June this year. It was previously the 1st of May last year, needed to be vaccinated in that setting if you worked in the aged care or you're a visitor coming in. But again, we'll need some flexibility in this space in terms of the timeline so that we get the 14-day gap and then we don't disrupt the second dose, particularly of the Pfizer vaccine. Will the state government be assisting private non-government funded respiratory clinics with consumables? No, we're not anticipating to supply consumables in this space. The Commonwealth is actually responsible for procuring the consumables. So this is the great time we can talk about the low dead space syringes and the vials, and how many doses do you get out of a vial. So when we talk about the Pfizer vaccine, it comes in a vial. You need to put 1.3 mils of saline, I believe is what I've got, 1.8 mils of saline in the vial. And then if you use a low dead space syringe, you can get 6 doses out of the vial. However, we do not have low dead space syringes yet here in the country available, ready to roll, ready to use. So hopefully they'll be available very soon, and we'll be able to guarantee that we get our 6 doses out of a vial. So you cannot unfortunately mix the 2 vials together. You can't say, I've got 0.1 in one vial, 0.3 another, and then mixed it. You can't do that. You have to use the 1 vial per vaccine, and that's standard approach, and that's the Pfizer advice as well. So therefore we really do need these low dead space syringes so that we can make sure that we're not wasting so much of the vaccine, which would be good, wouldn't it? But in terms of, is the state government assisting? No, it's a Commonwealth based in terms of consumables. So I hope that answers that there. Is it going to be an annual vaccine? Who knows, Branka? We don't know, do we?
Oh, it depends how the Northern Hemisphere handles the transmission over there. We do know that, unfortunately, the variants that have emerged from United Kingdom, Brazil, as well as South Africa, the vaccines do have reduced efficacy against them. So, we've never had a coronavirus vaccine. The respiratory vaccines are very difficult to make, and but then again, coronaviruses do mutate at a much lower rate than influenza does. So that's one plus. I think the key is to reduce transmission with increased immune pressure, so that we are not getting variants that are escaping the immune system, that are more transmissible, or they become more deadlier and causes problems with the vaccine rollout. But Moderna is rolling out a vaccine, I think at the end of the year, which should cover the South African variant, which seems to be the one of greatest concern at the moment.
Thank you. All right, we had a few other questions come through around, will GPs be obtaining the consent in aged care facilities, or will that be arranged by Astra Medical? Yes, so my understanding is it's arranged to the provider who's coming in with, and the consent is done by the practitioner coming in, the registered nurse coming in to talk through, and also with the staff that they've employed. If GPs are vaccinating those aged over 60, but the AstraZeneca is not recommended, what we'll do? Look, I think more information will come out around the AstraZeneca age over 65. I think watch this space a little bit in terms of where we're up to over the next couple of weeks, and what the role will be in terms of general practice. Private practices that are swabbing, thank you for swabbing, everyone. We need everyone swabbed. We need not turn people away without being swabbed. Am I part of 1A? Technically, no, based on our priority groups. However, I really would make sure you do get vaccinated at the beginning of 1B, which will be only a few weeks after 1A. And that's just based on the Commonwealth criteria that we've been given in that space. GPs seeing patients with disabilities in community housing, I can't say what they will get in terms of Pfizer or AstraZeneca, sorry, in that area. But certainly as part of 1A, the Pfizer vaccine is the first that's being used through DHS. What about the geriatric wards and SA hospitals? In terms of the patients, yes. So if there's patients there and we're vaccinating, then that might be something for discussion in terms of where that individual is located when it's being rolled out, particularly in our regional areas. Is it probable that one of the single dose vaccines, oh yes, the Johnson & Johnson, so that's exciting as well, in development, will be made available for approved in children towards the end of the year?
Yeah, well, in my personal opinion, I think that Johnson & Johnson is a potential game changer when it comes to vaccines, and it's going to be essentially important in curbing transmission and infection rates in poor and undeveloped countries, simply because it's very cheap to make. It has excellent, I think it was a little bit downplayed in the media, its actual efficacy, that people have forgotten this is a single shot vaccine, and they've compared it to Moderna and Pfizer that were evaluated much earlier on in the pandemic. They were evaluated against the original strain of the virus. This vaccine was the first real-time data that's actually emerged against the UK variant, the South African variant. So they do have a very large study underway as well. That is a 2-shot vaccine, and it's also very cheap. And it's quite safe because their vector, which is adeno26, it's a rare adenoviral vector, very similar to AstraZeneca, except that this is a rare human adenovirus that already infects humans, so it's a little bit better in terms of getting inside of our cells. It's already approved for Ebola. It's licensed for Ebola in the UK, the same vaccine. So it's been extensively tested, and as you can tell, it's one of my favorites. So I hope it does really well.
Yeah, we're certainly holding out. It'll be an absolute game changer, you're right. And now next questions, we've had a few things that have been around, oh gosh, I've lost my spot where I was, and we're getting towards the end here. Patients on immunosuppressants for rheumatoid arthritis, yes, very safe, definitely be recommending. After vaccination, is there any contagiousness? Do I need to wear a mask? No, that because there's no live virus at all involved, and there's no concern at all with mask usage. However, some hospitals are requiring you to wear a mask when you come in and be vaccinated, just based on their healthcare policy. No concern for people on ACE inhibitors or ARBs as well in unwanted side effects. If we're eligible for 1A as a GP and ED, how will be identified. So all the LHNs rurally ill will be going through all their staff lists, and we've already seen some of those initially. So you'll be covered in 1A for that group. From phase 1B, I think we've talked around that in terms of it's going to be both vaccines in 1B. And is there a cheat sheet FAQ available? I'm so excited. It's got signed off today. So that will go up tomorrow, hopefully, Alvin, on the website. We put a lot of work into our SA Health FAQ, and we're using that for the basis of our consent forms. And they'll be continually updated when we get more information as well. So there's both an FAQ form, a consent form that will go online as well to help people. What about pharmacists that deliver to aged care? In terms of no, they're not. I'm not aware that they're included in that group, but it would really depend, I think, on what the Commonwealth decide, but not that I would be aware of at this stage. It really is around those caring who are going in and having direct contact. But if you're going in and doing a medication review, then that might be a case to discuss. I think we've talked a lot about the 65-year group already. There's a good podcast on ABC Science Friction about the development of the Pfizer vaccine as well. Thank you for that suggestion. And there's lots and lots of Q&As in the chat box. Thank you for posting that. I have not seen it. I apologise for that. Hopefully the FAQs will answer a lot of that in terms of one that will be uploaded tomorrow on the website. Is there a vaccine certificate? We are providing a vaccine certificate, but also it will be recorded through the AIR system that you can then download, which is good. Through Pro, is it through Pro, how you access your My Health record, MyGov system. The assumption is that once vaccinated, testing for COVID will be, no. So very exciting here at SA. We've got our 2 serology machines all ready to go. So one measures, now tell me if I'm wrong, Bronca, one measures the capsule, no, and one measures the capsid.
One measures the capsid and one measures the spike antibody.
The spike. So there is a way to differentiate between the two, between infection and immunization. However, really important to note, we will not be checking serology on people routinely. So as part of that, there's no requirement at all to check to see if you've developed a good antibody response. We won't be doing routine serology. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that at all.
It's a bit of a Pandora's box, isn't it? I mean, we run a statewide clinical trial on COVID patients in South Australia, and we always get asked by our trial participants that are all convalescent COVID patients at the moment, what is their antibody status? And our advice is it's a Pandora's box. We can't tell people that you have a very high antibody titer and then you disregard all public health guidelines that have been put in place. So I do tend to agree. I think, and running routine serology would be extremely expensive for the state as well, I presume. So there's 2 sides to it, I think. We certainly don't want people to disregard the public health guidelines that have been implemented to curb the transmission or infection.
Yeah, so we need to educate more in that space, don't we, really, around what it means. And also if people think, oh, if I do the saliva testing or have a nasal swab, will I test positive? No, you cannot test positive on after having a vaccine, which is important then to mention here, because we will be still swabbing people routinely post-vaccination as well in our hotel system. People ask and say, oh, does that mean I have to do the swab? And say, no, sadly not, particularly when you're dealing with COVID positive patients, particularly until we don't know that whole point of transmissibility as well yet, and how easily transmissible the virus is if you are infected. Wait time post-vaccination is 30 minutes, is the requirement that's been set through ATAGI, is a 30-minute wait time post-vaccination, which is standard across the board to look for any signs of adverse events or allergic reaction. In terms of issues with the injection itself, it's been, mild side effects experienced, soreness at the site, muscle aches and pains, headache, fever, usual vaccine mild side effects. We'd had some reports come out of the UK that that they'd seen a drop off in their workforce post-vaccination for a couple of days because they had quite a number of flu-like symptoms. So we've given advice out to expect 20% of people who in your workforce, if you're vaccinating, that could have side effects. That means they won't come to work the next day because they feel very fatigued and tired. So we've set to plan for that. So same with your practices as well. Think about that with your vaccine. You don't all get vaccinated at once. Maybe spread it out over the week so that you're not all having the same day off if you do manage to have some side effects afterwards. I don't know if you want to make a comment about that in terms of that, Branka, at all.
No, just that there needs to be, especially with RNA vaccines, that needs to be greater education in terms of that we do expect more side effects in terms of soreness of the arm, fever, just feeling a little bit off. That is a very common feature of these vaccines, and it's something that I think we need to educate our GPs in order for them to reassure the public that it is perfectly normal and safe, and this is how the vaccine works.
Thank you. Look, we've really come to the end of time, and I know there's so many questions here that we haven't answered. I've tried to quickly go through and see in terms of are there ones that we really need to, are really pertinent to discuss. The booster vaccine, look, we don't know what in terms will emerge after that for next year's. No, it doesn't need to be the same brand, but we know for that second dose, it does need to be the same vaccine to build up that response, but not for booster vaccines. Branka, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to say that there is a number of studies underway at the moment to see if we can combine different vaccines. So can you get Pfizer vaccine as your first dose, AstraZeneca as your second, and so on. So those studies are all underway in the Northern Hemisphere at the moment.
Thank you. Now, just one question I will just quickly ask you was around Bell's palsy. There's a comment that's come through here around where person who has Guillain-Barré syndrome in the past, should they have the vaccine? I don't know if you
I don't know. There was some concerns with transverse myelitis, I think, with the AstraZeneca vaccine, but that was quite rare. And one of the participants didn't say they had MS, but that's, it's so rare and not something that's been really investigated, looked at or reported. So I can't say either way.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really covered all. I'm just so grateful, Branka, to have your assistance here. And I'm sorry we couldn't have Rob here, who's our vaccine expert, who's coming into SA Health now as our expert advisor into the vaccine program. Rob being the previous Chief Health Officer in Victoria and then working in our COVID response here. He's a wealth of knowledge. So sorry he couldn't be here today. So I've asked you all my questions that I couldn't answer. So thank you, Branka. It was very, very helpful.
Pleasure.
And it's been a delight having so many GPs join the call today and listen and see where we're up to the vaccine rollout. Look, I'm always very happy to have emails sent in terms of if you would like further information or questions that we haven't answered that you'd really like to talk through. Unfortunately, there's just so many uncertainties in this place still in terms of what vaccine's going to go where, what's happening with the GP rollout, all of those aspects. I know we'd all love to have more answers to, but unfortunately over the next 2 weeks, we hopefully will get them, but we don't have them quite yet. So thank you very much for your time this evening, and a really big thank you as well to the RACGP. When we discussed we needed to educate GPs of what was happening with the vaccine space, I said to Roberta and Elaine, I said, we're going to have to move very quickly and get this moving. So I was very grateful that I was able to organise this within a week. So thank you, Branka, for joining us. It's been wonderful.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me.
All right. Take care, everyone. Bye.